The shepherd's crook lay in the peat moss, its handle worn smooth by years of grip, but positioned too carefully, as though placed rather than dropped. The wood was dry despite the morning dew that silvered every blade of moorland grass around it, and that single detail made Watson pause, his medical bag still in hand, breath misting in the cold dawn air. Somewhere across the expanse of Dartmoor, a curlew called, its cry lonely and descending, and the scent of wet earth mixed with something else, something faintly chemical, like burnt match heads left too long in a drawer. The constable beside him, a ruddy-faced man named Cartwright, whose uniform seemed too new for these ancient hills, shifted his weight and said nothing. His silence had the quality of a man who had already decided what he believed, and would not be persuaded otherwise. Watson knelt, careful not to disturb the surrounding ground, and studied the crook more closely. 3 feet away, the shepherd himself lay crumpled against a standing stone, his face turned toward the eastern sky, as though he had been watching for sunrise. But his eyes held no peace. Whatever expression had frozen there in the final moments suggested terror, yes, but a terror that seemed almost theatrical, the mouth too wide, the hands clutched not at his chest or throat, but flung outward, fingers spread, as though someone had arranged him to tell a specific story. "Found him at first light," Cartwright said finally, his Devonshire accent thick and slow. "Young Tom Bevins, bringing his flock down from the high pasture. Said he heard the hound last night. Said he heard it clear." Watson did not respond immediately. He was looking at the dead man's coat, heavy wool, the kind shepherds wore against the moor's persistent damp, torn at the shoulder in 3 parallel lines. The fabric gaped open, revealing the shirt beneath, and on the wool itself, at the edges of the tear, a faint luminescence lingered even in the strengthening daylight. He had seen phosphorescence before, on certain fungi, on decaying wood in summer forests, but never on wool, and never with this particular greenish quality that seemed to cling like frost that refused to melt. He touched it carefully with one gloved finger. The residue transferred, glowing faintly against the leather. "You'll want to be careful, sir," Cartwright said, and there was something in his voice, not quite warning, not quite satisfaction. "They say the hound's breath does that, leaves its mark." Watson stood slowly, his knees protesting the cold ground, and looked out across the moor. It stretched in all directions, a vast tableland of peat and heather broken by granite tors that rose like ancient sentinels against a sky that couldn't quite decide between grey and blue. The morning mist was lifting in patches, revealing and concealing in turns, and in the distance, perhaps a mile away, perhaps 2, distance being a fluid thing on Dartmoor, a stand of twisted hawthorn marked the edge of Grimpen Mire, where the ground turned treacherous, and the unwary could sink beyond retrieval. Beautiful in its desolate way, and utterly indifferent to human fear. "The footprints," Watson said. "Show me where they begin." Cartwright led him 20 paces north, where the peat was softer and took impressions readily. Here, clear as ink on parchment, were the prints of a large dog, larger than any hound Watson had seen in his years with the army, larger even than the mastiffs kept by country estates for show and intimidation. The paw prints pressed deep, suggesting significant weight, and they ran in a straight line toward the standing stone where the shepherd lay. But 15 feet from the body they simply stopped, not faded, not obscured by other marks or disturbed ground, simply ended, as though the creature that made them had been lifted whole into the air. Watson crouched again, examining the last clear print. The depth was consistent with the others. The spacing suggested a running gait, not a leap. And yet, beyond this point, nothing, only unmarked moorland grass and the inevitable sheep tracks that wandered everywhere and nowhere. "Wind took the scent away," Cartwright offered, but his voice held no conviction. "Or it jumped the rest. They can jump, can't they? Big dogs." "They can," Watson agreed quietly. "But not without landing," he thought. "Not without leaving some mark of arrival." He straightened once more and turned his attention to the moor itself, letting his gaze sweep the horizon in the methodical pattern Holmes had taught him years ago. Grid the landscape, note the anomalies, question the absences as much as the presences. To the west, the tor called King's Barrow rose dark against the paling sky, its summit crowned with the remains of a Bronze Age cairn that locals said was haunted by older things than hounds. To the east, smoke rose from Grimpen village, a mile and a half distant, cook fires being lit, daily life resuming despite the night's events. And to the south, there, a flicker of movement, or perhaps the memory of movement, near a cluster of ruins that might once have been a shepherd's hut. Watson watched for a full minute, but saw nothing more. Still, the impression remained. He and Cartwright were not alone on this moor. "Tell me about the others," Watson said. Cartwright's weathered face tightened. "Others, sir. The other sightings, the other incidents. A man doesn't die of fright in isolation, Constable. Fear builds. It is fed. So tell me, what has been feeding it?" A long pause, during which the curlew called again, closer now, and the mist continued its slow retreat. Finally, Cartwright sighed, a sound that seemed to come from some deep and weary place. "Started 3 weeks back," he said. "Old Mrs. Whitmore, walking home from her daughter's farm at dusk, said she saw it on the ridge above Merripit House, a great black shape with eyes like coals. 2 days after that, the Frankland boy, he's simple, mind you, but not a liar, swore he saw it crossing the moor toward Laughter Hall, and said its jaws glowed green, like marsh light. Since then, well, sir, there's been a dozen reports, maybe more, always at dusk or dawn, always near the old Baskerville lands, and always the same description, enormous, black, with that unholy light about its mouth." Watson listened, cataloguing not just the words, but the pattern within them. "And the deaths?" "2 now. Old Samuel Harding, found a week ago near Fox Tor Mire, his heart give out, they said. And now this poor soul." Cartwright gestured at the shepherd. "Both on Baskerville property, both at night, both with that look on them, like they'd seen damnation itself." The Baskerville name hung in the air between them, heavy with history. Watson knew the legend, of course. Holmes had summarized it during their brief meeting in London 3 days prior, before Watson had caught the train west. A curse dating back generations, a spectral hound that hunted the Baskerville line, a history of untimely deaths on this very moor. Sir Charles Baskerville, the most recent inheritor, had died of heart failure just 2 months ago, found near the garden gate of Baskerville Hall, with that same expression of terminal fright frozen on his features. And now Sir Henry Baskerville, a young Canadian who had inherited title and estate from his late uncle, was arriving to claim his birthright, arriving into a landscape that seemed determined to tell him he was not welcome. "Where is Sir Henry now?" Watson asked. "Baskerville Hall, sir. Arrived 3 days ago from London. Brought his own man with him, but already 2 of the house staff have given notice. Won't stay on the moor after dark, they said. Can't say I blame them." Watson turned back to the body, considering. The staging of it, the convenient tears on the coat, the phosphorescent residue that would glow in darkness and suggest supernatural origin, the footprints that began clearly and ended impossibly. All of it had the feel of theatre, of a performance meant to convince. But convince whom, and to what end? Holmes's telegram had been characteristically brief. "Baskerville affair requires eyes I trust. You will go? I will follow when threads converge. Observe everything. Assume nothing supernatural. Wire daily. S.H." So Watson had come, arriving in Devonshire the previous evening, taking a room at the Northumberland Arms in Grimpen village, and rising before dawn, when the constable's urgent knock had summoned him to this cold hillside and its carefully arranged horror. "I'll need to examine the body more thoroughly," Watson said, "and I'll want to speak with young Tom Bevins, the shepherd who found him. But first, Constable, a question. Who benefits if Sir Henry Baskerville leaves this place?" Cartwright's expression shifted, something guarded moving behind his eyes. "That's not for me to say, sir." "Then say it anyway." A longer pause. The mist had lifted enough, now that Watson could see Baskerville Hall itself in the distance, a grey stone manor set against the flank of the moor, like a fortress that had lost its war with time. Smoke rose from several chimneys. The house was awake then, and perhaps already aware of this latest death on its doorstep. "There's talk of a cousin," Cartwright said finally. "Distant relation. Lives out on the moor at Merripit House. Name of Stapleton. Naturalist, they say. Studies butterflies and plants and such. Came to Dartmoor 5 years back. Keeps to himself, mostly. But he's been seen about the hall since Sir Henry arrived. Paying calls, being neighbourly. And if Sir Henry were to leave, or prove unable to manage the estate, then I suppose questions might be asked about succession, sir. About who has the next claim." Cartwright met Watson's gaze steadily. "But that's just talk, Dr. Watson. Village gossip. Probably nothing to it." Probably, Watson thought. But Holmes had not sent him to Dartmoor to investigate probabilities. He knelt once more beside the shepherd, this time checking the man's hands, his boots, the position of his limbs, with the careful attention he had learned in Afghanistan and refined in London. The hands showed no defensive wounds. The boots were intact, laced properly, suggesting no struggle or flight. And most telling of all, the man's pockets had not been disturbed, his small leather purse still containing 3 shillings and a few pence. Whatever had killed him, robbery was not the motive. Watson took a small glass vial from his medical bag and carefully scraped a sample of the phosphorescent residue from the torn coat. In London, in Holmes's chemical corner of their Baker Street rooms, this substance might tell a story very different from the legend it was meant to support. The sun had fully risen now, and the moor transformed in its light, still bleak, still vast, but less oppressive, as though daylight restored a measure of reason to the landscape. Watson stood, brushing peat from his knees, and looked once more toward the distant ruins, where he had sensed watching eyes. Nothing moved there now, but he filed the location in his memory none the less. "Have the body brought to the village doctor," Watson said. "I'll examine him more thoroughly there, and send word to Baskerville Hall that I'll be calling this afternoon. Sir Henry should know what's happened on his land." "As you say, sir." Cartwright hesitated. "If you don't mind my asking, Dr. Watson, do you believe in the hound? In the curse?" Watson considered the question, choosing his words carefully. "I believe," he said slowly, "that fear is a powerful thing, Constable. It can stop hearts. It can empty houses. It can make men see what they expect to see, rather than what is truly there. As for curses—" He glanced down at the shepherd, at the staged terror on his face. "I believe men make their own curses and call them fate." He turned and began walking back toward the village, his medical bag in hand, the vial of phosphorescent residue carefully secured. Behind him, Cartwright called out instructions to the two men who had been waiting at a respectful distance with a stretcher. The moor stretched away on all sides, empty and ancient, keeping its secrets beneath layers of peat and history. But Watson had learned, in his years, with Sherlock Holmes, that secrets were simply puzzles waiting for patient hands. Somewhere in London, Holmes was already gathering threads. Here on Dartmoor, Watson would gather his own. And tonight, when darkness returned and the moor came alive with whispers and fear, he would listen very carefully to what the silence tried to hide. The carriage that brought Watson to Baskerville Hall travelled along a road that seemed to resist progress at every turn, winding through moorland that pressed close on both sides like a living thing testing the boundaries of human ambition. The driver, an elderly man named Perkins, who had served the Baskerville family for 40 years, spoke little during the journey, but his silence had a different quality than the constable's earlier reticence. This was the silence of a man who had seen too much, and had learned that discretion was its own form of survival. The afternoon light lay thin and grey across the landscape, that peculiar quality of Dartmoor, illumination that seemed to drain colour from everything it touched, rendering the world in shades of slate and shadow. To the left, the great Grimpen Mire stretched away toward the horizon, its surface deceptively smooth, marked here and there by tufts of cotton grass that waved gently in the persistent breeze. Beautiful, Watson thought, in the way that dangerous things often were, inviting the eye while concealing the quicksand beneath, the peat bogs that could swallow a man whole and leave no trace save perhaps a hat floating on stagnant water. To the right, the moorland rose in gentle swells toward the tors, those granite outcroppings that gave the landscape its particular character, ancient, patient, and utterly indifferent to the small dramas of inheritance and fear that played out in their shadows. King's Barrow, Fox Tor, the Cleft Tor, names that belonged to a time before maps, before roads, before the idea of ownership had carved the wild land into parcels and estates. "There, sir," Perkins said, breaking his long silence. "Baskerville Hall." The house emerged from the moor as though it had grown there, rather than been built. Its grey stone walls the same colour as the granite tors, its narrow windows watching the approach, with what seemed like suspicion. It was not a large manor by the standards of English aristocracy, perhaps 30 rooms, Watson estimated, arranged in an L shape around a courtyard that would offer some protection from the wind. But size was irrelevant here. What mattered was presence, and Baskerville Hall had that in abundance. 3 centuries of history pressed down upon its roof like a physical weight, and even in daylight Watson could feel the oppressive sense of legacy that clung to its walls. The architecture spoke of different eras layered one upon another. An Elizabethan core with mullioned windows and tall chimneys, a Georgian wing added when prosperity had briefly touched the family, and everywhere the signs of slow decay that came when maintenance was deferred year after year, generation after generation. The roof slates were mismatched where repairs had been made with whatever materials came to hand. The stone lintels above the windows showed cracks that had been filled, but not properly fixed. The iron gates that marked the entrance to the drive hung slightly askew, one hinge rusted through, held in place by habit and stubbornness rather than proper engineering. This was the inheritance Sir Henry Baskerville had travelled 3,000 miles to claim. Not just land and title, but the accumulated weight of generations who had tried to tame this corner of Dartmoor, and had, at best, achieved an uneasy truce. The carriage rolled to a stop before the main entrance, where a coat of arms carved above the door showed a hound, rampant, black against a shield of faded gilt, its teeth bared, its posture aggressive. Someone had draped a length of black crape across the carving, mourning for the late Sir Charles, but the fabric had weathered poorly and now hung in tatters, giving the hound the appearance of emerging from shadow. "Sir Henry is expecting you, Dr. Watson," Perkins said, climbing down to open the carriage door. "Though I should warn you, sir, he's in a particular mood today. Found his boots moved this morning. Small thing, perhaps, but after everything else." He left the thought unfinished, but Watson understood. In a house where fear had been systematically cultivated, even small disturbances took on outsized significance. The interior of Baskerville Hall matched its exterior, a study in faded grandeur and genteel decline. The entrance hall stretched 40 feet to a carved wooden staircase that split left and right at a landing beneath a stained glass window depicting, inevitably, another hound. This one at rest, its head on its paws, but its eyes alert, watching. The floor was polished oak, scuffed by centuries of boots, and the walls were lined with portraits that climbed toward the high ceiling in double rows. Generations of Baskervilles watching the present, with expressions that ranged from stern disapproval to weary resignation. The smell was what struck Watson most forcefully, a combination of wood smoke, damp stone, old books, and something else, something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in standing water. Not unpleasant, exactly, but persistent, the kind of scent that would cling to clothing and follow a person into dreams. A butler materialized from a side passage, an elderly man whose livery had been brushed to within an inch of its life, but could not disguise its age. His face was professionally neutral, but Watson noted the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes flickered toward the windows, as though checking escape routes. "Dr. Watson, sir. Sir Henry is in the library, if you'll follow me." They passed through rooms that spoke of better days. A drawing room with furniture covered by dust sheets. Dining hall with a table that could seat 20, but looked like it hadn't hosted a proper dinner in years. A morning room where the wallpaper had faded in stripes where sunlight once reached, but now seemed unable to penetrate the general gloom. Everywhere the signs of a household running on minimal staff, surfaces dusted but not polished, carpets swept but showing wear, the small accumulated neglects that came when there were too few hands to maintain too large a house. The library occupied the ground floor of the Georgian wing, a long room lined floor to ceiling with books whose leather bindings, exhaled the particular perfume of old paper and scholarly ambition. A fire burned in the grate, despite the moderate temperature, and before it stood a young man in his early 30s, hands clasped behind his back, staring into the flames with an intensity that suggested he was seeing something other than burning coals. "Dr. Watson, sir," the butler announced, and retreated before Watson could even register his departure. Sir Henry Baskerville turned, and Watson's first impression was of vitality barely contained. A man built for action and open spaces, transplanted into this house of shadows and finding himself fundamentally unsuited to the role. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, with the broad shoulders and sun-weathered complexion of someone who had spent years working outdoors. His hair was dark and thick, worn slightly longer than London fashion dictated, and his eyes were a startling blue that seemed almost out of place in the grey landscape of Dartmoor. He wore tweeds rather than formal attire, and his boots were sturdy, practical things that suggested he took the moorland paths seriously. But what struck Watson most was the expression on his face. Not fear, exactly, but a kind of defiant confusion, the look of a rational man confronting circumstances that persistently defied rationality. "Dr. Watson," Sir Henry said, his accent carrying the broader vowels of North America mixed with something that might have been his father's Devon burr, inherited across the Atlantic like the title and the curse. "Thank you for coming. I hope the journey wasn't too grim, though I suppose grim is rather the theme here, isn't it?" He gestured toward a pair of leather chairs positioned before the fire, and Watson took the one offered, noting the way Sir Henry remained standing, too restless to sit. "I heard about the shepherd," Sir Henry continued. "Perkins brought word this morning. Another death on Baskerville land, another man found with terror on his face and talk of the hound on everyone's lips." He turned to face Watson directly. "I'm not a superstitious man, Doctor. I was raised in Alberta, in country that makes Dartmoor look like a garden park. I've dealt with wolves, blizzards, cattle stampedes, and claim jumpers. I don't frighten easily. But this—" He trailed off, gesturing vaguely toward the windows, toward the moor beyond, 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 toward the moor beyond. Accumulated weight of the unexplainable. Watson leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the incidents. Everything that's happened since you arrived. Sir Henry finally sat, perching on the edge of the chair as though ready to spring up at any moment. First night here, 3 days ago, I woke to sounds in the hallway. Footsteps, I thought. But when I opened my door, there was no one there. Could have been the house settling. God knows it's old enough. But the sound stopped the moment I opened the door, and there was a smell, like something chemical, or burnt. Watson's attention sharpened. The same smell as this morning, near the shepherd's body. I wouldn't know about that, but I've noticed it twice since, always at night, always drifting up from somewhere in the house I can't quite locate. Sir Henry paused, running a hand through his hair. Second night, I found my boots in the hallway. I'd left them outside my door for cleaning, but they were moved, placed carefully at the top of the stairs, toes pointing toward the front door, as though suggesting I should leave. Did you mention this to the staff? To Barrymore, he's the butler you met. He claimed ignorance, said the night porter must have moved them, but there is no night porter. We're running on a skeleton staff. 3 people quit the day after I arrived. 2 more gave notice yesterday. They won't say why exactly, but the message is clear enough. Watson nodded slowly, processing. And last night I heard the howl. Sir Henry's voice dropped, losing some of its forced steadiness. I was in this room, reading late, trying to make sense of the estate accounts. The windows were open because I can't bear the stuffiness in here. And then, clear as church bells, I heard it. A long, rising howl from somewhere out on the moor. Not close, but not distant either. Somewhere in between, where sound plays tricks and you can't quite judge distance. Did you investigate? I went to the window. The moon was up, nearly full, and I could see the moor well enough. There was mist in the low places, but the higher ground was clear. And on the ridge above Grimpen Mire, he stopped, seeming to gather himself. I saw something moving, large, low to the ground, black against the skyline. It moved along the ridge for perhaps 30 seconds, and then it was gone, dropped into the mist and vanished. You saw it clearly enough to describe it? Clearly enough to know it was big, bigger than any dog I've ever seen. But at that distance, in that light, Sir Henry shook his head. I can't swear to what I saw, Dr. Watson. I can only tell you what my eyes reported, and what my gut tells me is that someone is trying very hard to make me afraid. There it was. The same conclusion Watson had reached, spoken aloud by a man who had every reason to believe in the curse, but who chose, despite everything, to search for human agency behind the supernatural veneer. "You've had visitors?" Watson asked. "One. A Mr. Stapleton. Lives about 2 miles from here at Merripit House. Came calling yesterday afternoon. Very friendly, very welcoming. He's a naturalist. Studies the flora and fauna of the moor. Seemed genuinely interested in helping me settle in. Offered to act as a guide to the local landscape." Sir Henry's expression shifted slightly. He also mentioned, quite casually, that his grandmother was a Baskerville. "Distant relation," he said. "Nothing that would affect the inheritance, but enough to establish a connection." Watson filed this away carefully. And his manner? Precise, almost scientific, as though he were observing me while we spoke. He asked quite detailed questions about my plans for the estate, whether I intended to stay or simply manage things from London. He seemed pleased when I said I wasn't sure yet. The fire crackled softly, and somewhere deeper in the house, a clock chimed the hour. 4 o'clock, the day already beginning, its slide toward evening. Watson stood and walked to the window, looking out across the moorland that stretched toward the horizon in its varied shades of brown and grey and muted green. Beautiful, dangerous, and ancient. A landscape that had swallowed generations and would swallow more if given the chance. "Mr. Holmes sent me ahead," Watson said, not turning from the window. "He believes there is a rational explanation for everything that's happened here, and I'm inclined to agree with him. But rational doesn't mean harmless, Sir Henry. Someone is orchestrating this campaign of fear with considerable skill and patience. The question is, why? To drive me away, perhaps, or to drive you toward something specific. A decision, an action, a state of mind that serves someone's purpose." Watson turned back. "For now, I suggest we proceed carefully but visibly. I'll stay here at the hall if you'll have me. 2 sets of eyes are better than 1, and whoever is behind this may make a mistake, if they know they're being watched." Sir Henry's expression showed relief, quickly masked. "I'd be grateful for the company, Doctor. This house is not conducive to solitary contemplation." "Then it's settled." Watson glanced at his pocket watch. "I should return to the village to collect my things and make arrangements. I'll be back before dark. In the meantime, Sir Henry, I'd advise you to note anything unusual, no matter how small. The devil, as they say, is in the details." "Or the hound," Sir Henry said with a slight smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Here on the moor, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference." Watson made his way back through the echoing halls, escorted by the nervous butler, and climbed into the waiting carriage. As Perkins urged the horses forward, Watson looked back at Baskerville Hall, at its narrow windows reflecting the afternoon light like watching eyes, at the tattered crape still hanging from the stone hound above the door. Somewhere on the moor, someone was watching, someone was orchestrating. Someone had decided that Sir Henry Baskerville should be afraid, and Watson intended to find out who and why before the campaign of fear escalated from theatre into tragedy. The carriage rolled back along the winding road, and the moor closed in behind them like a door slowly shutting. Watson woke to his first full morning at Baskerville Hall with the feeling that the house had been holding its breath all night, waiting for something that never quite arrived. His room was in the eastern wing, a generous chamber with oak panelling that had darkened to the colour of strong tea, and a four-poster bed whose curtains smelled faintly of lavender and thyme. The window looked out across the moor toward the village of Grimpen, where morning smoke rose in thin grey lines against a sky that promised rain before evening. He had slept poorly, waking several times to sounds that might have been wind in the eaves, or might have been footsteps in distant corridors, and once, around 3 in the morning, to that same chemical smell Sir Henry had mentioned, drifting under his door like an unwelcome visitor. By the time he rose and opened the door to investigate, the scent had dissipated, leaving only the usual house smells of old wood and cold stone. Now, dressed and ready for the day's investigation, Watson made his way down to the breakfast room, where he found Sir Henry already seated, working his way through eggs and bacon with the determined appetite of a man refusing to let circumstance affect his morning routine. "Sleep well?" Sir Henry asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Well enough," Watson lied politely, taking the seat opposite. "Though I understand what you mean about the house. It has a particular presence after dark. That's a diplomatic way of putting it." Sir Henry poured coffee from a silver pot that had probably been polished every day for 100 years. "Barrymore tells me one of the maids gave notice this morning. Won't even stay through the week. Said she heard breathing outside her door last night, but when she opened it, the hallway was empty." Watson accepted the coffee, noting the slight tremor in Sir Henry's hand as he poured. "I'd like to explore the grounds today, if you'll permit it. Map the immediate area, speak with any staff who remain, perhaps walk out toward the places where sightings have been reported." "I'll come with you," Sir Henry said immediately. "I've been cooped up in this house long enough, and I'd rather face whatever's out there in daylight than sit here wondering." They finished breakfast in companionable silence, and by 9 o'clock they were stepping out into a morning that had the peculiar brightness that comes before a storm, the light sharp and clear, every detail of the landscape rendered in almost painful precision. Watson carried his walking stick and a small notebook for observations, while Sir Henry wore his practical Canadian boots and a coat that had seen genuine wilderness rather than English country lanes. The immediate grounds of Baskerville Hall consisted of perhaps 10 acres of what had once been formal gardens, but had long since reverted to a semi-wild state. The pathways remained, gravel and flagstone winding between overgrown beds where roses fought with brambles for dominance. A sundial stood at the centre of what had been a knot garden, its bronze face green with verdigris, its shadow pointing faithfully toward noon, despite the neglect all around it. "My uncle died there," Sir Henry said quietly, pointing toward an iron gate at the far end of the garden. Just beyond the gate, on the path that leads to the moor. They found him at dawn, sitting against the gatepost as though he'd simply decided to rest and never stood up again. Watson walked slowly toward the gate, observing everything. The gravel showed signs of recent passage, the servants, presumably, going about their duties. But near the gate itself, the ground was different, softer, taking impressions more readily. He knelt, examining the earth with the careful attention Holmes had instilled in him. "What do you see?" Sir Henry asked, standing a respectful distance back. Footprints, several days old, partially washed out by rain. Human, I think, though the definition is poor. And here. Watson pointed to a spot just inside the gate, where the mud showed a different kind of disturbance. Something was placed here, something with a flat base, left for perhaps an hour or two. The impression is shallow but distinct. A lantern, perhaps, or a small container. Sir Henry frowned. Why would anyone place a lantern here? To be seen from the house, Watson said slowly, standing and looking back at Baskerville Hall. This gate is visible from the library windows, is it not? And from several of the bedrooms on the eastern side. Yes, in fact, from my uncle's study on the first floor, this gate would be in direct line of sight. Watson filed this information carefully. A lantern placed here at night would be immediately visible to anyone in those rooms, would draw the eye naturally, would create a focal point around which imagination could construct all manner of threatening scenarios. They passed through the gate onto the moorland proper, and the change was immediate. The ordered world of the estate giving way to wilderness that acknowledged no human authority. The path was clear enough at first, a track worn by shepherds and estate workers, but within 100 yards it began to fragment into multiple faint traces that branched and rejoined according to logic only the Moor understood. The ground beneath their feet was treacherous in its variety, solid granite here, soft peat there, and always the danger of bog concealed beneath innocent-looking grass. Watson proceeded carefully, using his stick to test uncertain ground, while Sir Henry moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to reading landscape for its hidden threats. There, Sir Henry said, pointing northeast toward a low rise perhaps half a mile distant. That's where I saw the shape last night, along that ridgeline moving from west to east. Watson studied the terrain, calculating angles and sight lines. From Baskerville Hall to that ridge was roughly 800 yards, far enough that details would be obscured, close enough that movement would be clearly visible, especially against the skyline. Perfect distance for suggestion without revelation. "Let's walk there," he said. The journey took 20 minutes, picking their way across ground that alternated between springy heather and treacherous bog edge. Twice Watson tested what looked like solid ground, only to have his stick sink a foot deep into concealed mire, and both times Sir Henry guided them to safer passage with the ease of instinct or experience. The ridge, when they reached it, offered a commanding view of the valley below. Baskerville Hall clearly visible, the village of Grimpen to the south, and in the near distance, perhaps a mile away, a house that could only be Merripit House, where the naturalist Stapleton had made his home. "Look here," Watson said, kneeling where the peat gave way to exposed rock. On the granite surface, sheltered from rain by a slight overhang, were scratches, recent, made by metal rather than natural weathering. They formed a rough pattern, 3 marks in a triangle, and near them, pressed into a patch of soft ground that the overhang had protected, was a single clear boot print. Human, not animal. Size 9 or 10, Watson estimated, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. "Someone stood here recently," Watson said. "Stood for some time, judging by the depth of the impression. And these scratches, they might have been made by the metal base of a mirror, or a lantern with protective cage." Sir Henry's expression hardened. "You're saying someone was up here, deliberately, making themselves visible from the hall?" I'm saying it's consistent with that interpretation. Watson straightened, looking around with renewed attention. And if someone wanted to create the impression of a large animal moving along this ridge, this would be the ideal location, visible from multiple angles, but too far for clear identification. Add darkness, add suggestion, add the weight of legend, and the mind completes the picture. They continued along the ridge, and within 50 yards Watson found more evidence. A second set of scratches, another sheltered spot where someone might have waited, and most tellingly, a length of dark cloth caught on a gorse bush, coarse fabric, black or very dark brown, torn from something larger. Could be from a coat, Sir Henry said, examining the scrap. Or from a covering for an animal, Watson replied. Something to make a large dog appear even larger, to obscure its true shape. He carefully placed the fabric in his notebook. We're being shown a performance, Sir Henry. The question is whether we can trace it back to the performers. They descended from the ridge toward Merripit House, following a path that was better maintained than the ones near Baskerville Hall. The house itself came into view gradually, a low, modern building of grey stone with large windows facing south toward the moor. Smoke rose from one chimney, and as they approached, Watson could see cultivated beds of plants arranged with scientific precision rather than aesthetic appeal. A man emerged from the house before they reached the gate, tall, thin, perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of precise movements that suggested either military training or deeply ingrained self-discipline. He wore rough clothing suitable for field work, and his hands were stained with what looked like plant dyes. His face was sharp-featured, intelligent, with eyes that assessed and calculated even as he smiled in welcome. Sir Henry, he called, his voice cultured despite the rustic setting. And you must be Dr. Watson. Word travels quickly on the moor. Welcome to Merripit House. Watson studied Mr. Stapleton carefully as they shook hands. The grip was firm but not aggressive, the smile warm but not quite reaching the eyes. And there was something in his manner, a watchfulness, perhaps, or a quality of performance, that suggested every word and gesture was considered before execution. We were walking the moor, Sir Henry explained, getting the lay of the land. Splendid, though I hope you're staying to safe paths. The mire can be treacherous, especially after rain. Stapleton gestured toward his house. Will you come in? I've just made tea, and I'd be happy to share what I know of the local geography. I've mapped quite extensively during my time here. The interior of Merripit House was unlike anything Watson had expected. More laboratory than home, with tables covered in specimen cases, pressed plants, mounted on boards, and detailed charts of the moor showing topography, vegetation zones, and carefully marked danger areas. Books lined every wall, scientific texts mixed with what looked like family histories and genealogies. It was the workspace of an obsessive mind, organized and purposeful. But what caught Watson's attention most was a large journal lying open on the main work table, its pages covered in dense handwriting and careful diagrams. Before Stapleton could close it, and Watson saw the impulse in his quick movement toward the table, Watson glimpsed what looked like a sketch of Baskerville Hall, with sightlines marked in red ink, and below it a series of dates with times noted beside them. Forgive the clutter, Stapleton said, closing the journal smoothly and setting it aside. I'm in the middle of cataloguing the autumn migration patterns of certain moths. Fascinating creatures. They navigate by moonlight, you know, can be trained, after a fashion, to respond to specific frequencies of sound. He poured tea with the careful precision of a chemist measuring reagents, and as they settled into chairs near the window, Watson noticed a large cage in the corner, partially covered with cloth. Inside, dimly visible, was a dog, not the monstrous hound of legend, but a sizable mastiff cross, watching them with calm, intelligent eyes. "Your companion?" Watson asked, nodding toward the cage. "Ah, yes. I'm studying canine cognition as a side project. Remarkable animals, dogs, so easily trained to respond to cues humans can barely perceive. Did you know they can hear frequencies well above our range? A whistle pitched high enough is silent to us, but perfectly clear to them." Stapleton sipped his tea. Of course, such knowledge could be misused in the wrong hands. One could create quite alarming effects if one wished. The statement hung in the air, neither quite innocent nor quite threatening, and Watson met Stapleton's gaze steadily. "Could one?" "Indeed," Watson said quietly. Stapleton smiled, a thin expression that contained more satisfaction than warmth, and Watson knew, with the certainty that comes from years of reading human nature alongside Sherlock Holmes, that they had just been shown both confession and challenge, wrapped in scientific courtesy. The game, as Holmes would say, was most decidedly afoot. Watson's telegram to Holmes that evening was carefully worded, composed in the library at Baskerville Hall, while Sir Henry dozed fitfully in a chair by the fire. "Stagecraft confirmed. Naturalist shows his tools. Multiple systems evident. Advise immediate presence." The reply came within 2 hours, delivered by a breathless telegraph boy who had ridden out from Grimpen village through the gathering dusk. "Already there? Stone hut east of Merripit. Do not acknowledge. Continue visible investigation. Gather evidence. Will contact when time serves. Shake." Watson read the message twice, then fed it to the library fire, watching the paper curl and blacken. Already there. Of course Holmes was already there, had probably been on Dartmoor for days, watching, mapping, building his case from the shadows, while Watson played the part of obvious investigator, drawing attention and allowing Holmes to work unseen. The ancient game they had perfected over years of partnership. Watson as the visible knight, moving across the board, while Holmes positioned himself as the hidden bishop, controlling diagonals. The opponent never saw until checkmate. "Bad news?" Sir Henry asked, stirring from his half-sleep. "Quite the opposite," Watson replied. "Mr. Holmes suggests I continue my observations here. He's confident we'll have answers soon." What Watson did not say was that somewhere on the dark moor, in one of the prehistoric stone huts that dotted the high ground, Sherlock Holmes was watching Merripit House with the patience of a spider at the edge of its web, waiting for Stapleton to make the move that would confirm everything and reveal the final pieces of the puzzle. The next morning brought rain, not the gentle English rain of southern counties, but the horizontal, wind-driven rain of moorland that found every gap in clothing and turned the landscape into a study in grey misery. Watson woke to the sound of it hammering against his windows, and knew that outdoor investigation would be impossible until the weather cleared. Instead, he spent the morning in systematic exploration of Baskerville Hall itself, with Sir Henry as his guide and increasingly his confidant. The house yielded its secrets slowly. A servant's passage that connected the main wings, allowing movement through the building without being seen from the primary rooms. A lumber room on the top floor, where old furniture and trunks contained the accumulated debris of generations. and in the cellars a wine vault that extended far beyond what the house's modest size would suggest, with tunnels branching into darkness that Sir Henry admitted he had not yet fully explored. My uncle was not a man who entertained extensively, Sir Henry explained, as they stood at the entrance to the cellars, lantern in hand, looking into the damp shadows. But the Baskervilles of earlier centuries were different. There are stories of smuggling, of goods brought up from the coast through these tunnels, though whether the stories are true or simply family mythology, I couldn't say. Watson filed this information carefully. Tunnels meant hidden approach routes. Hidden routes meant someone with knowledge of the house's secrets could move unseen, could create disturbances, could stage hauntings with the confidence that escape routes existed. "Has Stapleton ever been down here?" Watson asked. Sir Henry paused, considering. "Not that I know of, but he's visited the hall several times over the years, I'm told. My uncle welcomed him as a fellow naturalist. They apparently spent hours discussing the flora and fauna of the Moor." Slight hesitation. "My uncle's journal mentions him frequently in the months before his death. Always helpful, always concerned, always suggesting that Uncle Charles take precautions, avoid the moor after dark, be mindful of his heart condition." "Suggesting fear?" Watson said quietly. "Planting seeds." "Yes." Sir Henry's voice hardened. "I'm beginning to think my uncle was frightened to death quite deliberately, Dr. Watson, and I'm beginning to wonder if I'm meant to follow the same path." By afternoon, the rain had eased to a persistent drizzle, and Watson decided to risk a walk toward the stone huts that dotted the eastern moor. He told Sir Henry he wanted to examine the prehistoric remains, to understand the landscape where his uncle had died. Sir Henry offered to accompany him, but Watson gently declined, suggesting that one of them should remain at the hall in case further incidents occurred. The truth, of course, was that Watson wanted to give Holmes the opportunity to make contact without witnesses. He set out at 3:00, dressed in waterproof coat and sturdy boots, carrying his walking stick and the small revolver he had taken to keeping in his pocket since the morning's discoveries in the cellars. The moor was transformed by rain. The colours deepened, the peat dark and treacherous, the granite tors emerging from mist like ancient monuments to forgotten gods. Watson walked steadily eastward, following no clear path, but keeping his general direction by the position of Baskerville Hall behind him and the looming presence of Black Tor ahead. The stone huts were scattered across this stretch of moorland, circular foundations of stacked granite that had sheltered Bronze Age families 3,000 years ago, and now provided occasional refuge for shepherds or, apparently, for consulting detectives in need of observation posts. He found Holmes in the fourth hut he checked, a particularly well-preserved structure with walls still standing to shoulder, height and enough roof remaining to offer shelter from the rain. Holmes sat on a flat stone inside, wrapped in a rough shepherd's cloak, his face darkened by days of sun and wind, his appearance so thoroughly transformed that Watson might have walked past him without recognition if not for the sharp, familiar eyes that looked up at his approach. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said calmly, as though they had parted that morning rather than a week ago. "Punctual as always. I've been expecting you since the rain eased. Do come in out of the drizzle." Watson squeezed through the low entrance and settled himself on a stone opposite Holmes, taking in the detective's temporary dwelling. A knapsack contained provisions, bread, cheese, dried fruit, a flask of water. A pair of binoculars rested within easy reach. and spread across a flat section of stone was a map of the Moor, marked extensively with notations in Holmes's precise hand. "How long have you been here?" Watson asked. 5 days. I arrived the evening before the shepherd's death, or rather, before his body was discovered. I witnessed the placement of that particular piece of theatre, though I was too far away to intervene, and thought it more valuable to observe than to prevent. Holmes gestured toward the map. "I've been tracking Stapleton's movements, documenting his system, and I must say, Watson, it's rather elegant in its construction. Multiple overlapping techniques, each one plausible alone, devastating in combination." "Tell me," Watson said simply. Holmes leaned forward, and despite the rough surroundings, despite the cold and damp, Watson saw the familiar fire of intellectual excitement in his friend's eyes, the look Holmes always wore when a problem was yielding its secrets. "Stapleton is conducting an experiment," Holmes began. "Not merely to drive Sir Henry from Baskerville Hall, though that is certainly his goal, but to prove a hypothesis about the malleability of human perception when fear is properly cultivated. He's documented everything, Watson. I've observed him writing in that journal of his, detailed notes about timing, about Sir Henry's responses, about the effectiveness of each technique." "The journal I glimpsed yesterday," Watson said, "with the sight lines and dates." "Exactly. Stapleton sees himself as a scientist studying human nature. The fact that he's destroying Sir Henry's peace of mind and possibly endangering his life is secondary to the data he's collecting." Holmes stood, moving to the entrance of the hut, looking out across the moor toward the distant shape of Merripit House. "The mechanisms are beautifully simple once you understand them. The hound itself is real, a mastiff crossbreed, trained extensively. But Stapleton enhances it with phosphorescent compound painted on its jaws and chest. Not the organic phosphorescence you found on the shepherd's coat, Watson, but a chemical preparation of his own devising. It glows in darkness, fades in daylight, and leaves minimal residue. Quite clever. And the howling. A whistle, pitched at approximately 20,000 hertz. Silent to human ears beyond middle age, but perfectly audible to dogs and to younger humans like Sir Henry. Stapleton can stand on his doorstep and summon the hound from a mile away, and no one past 40 would hear a thing. He uses it to coordinate the hound's movements with his other effects." Watson nodded slowly, pieces connecting. "The mirrors I found on the ridge." "Signal mirrors, yes. Stapleton has them positioned at key points across the moor. A lantern flash from one location is caught and reflected from another, creating the impression of movement, of the hound being in multiple places simultaneously. Simple heliography, Watson, but devastatingly effective when combined with suggestion and darkness." "And the footprints that vanish?" Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "Ah, that was clever. Stapleton has the hound trained to walk backwards and command, placing its feet in its own previous prints. The trail appears to end when, in fact, it simply reverses. I've watched him practice the technique behind Merripit House. The hound is remarkably well trained." "But why?" Watson asked. "Why go to such elaborate lengths? If Stapleton wants the estate, why not simply challenge the inheritance legally? Because he has no legal standing." Holmes returned to his seat, picking up a small notebook of his own. "I've spent the past 3 days conducting research via telegram to London. Stapleton's claim to Baskerville blood is genuine. His grandmother was, indeed, a Baskerville. But it's a distant connection, through a female line with multiple closer heirs before him. Under normal circumstances, he would never inherit. But if Sir Henry were to leave Dartmoor, or better yet, if he were to suffer a convenient heart failure like his uncle, attributed to the family curse, to fear, to the legendary hound, then questions might be raised about the Baskerville line's fitness to hold the estate, and in the resulting confusion, with proper legal manoeuvring, a distant but healthy claimant might make a case. "It's monstrous," Watson said quietly. "It's methodical," Holmes corrected. "Stapleton is not acting from passion or desperation. He's executing a plan that he's been developing for years. I believe he practiced on Sir Charles first, a test run, if you will. The old man's heart was weak, he was superstitious, and he lived alone, perfect subject for a proof of concept. And when it worked, when Sir Charles died of fright without a mark on him, Stapleton knew his method was sound." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp air. "And the shepherd, the other deaths?" "Refinements, adjustments, building the legend, creating witnesses, establishing the pattern. Stapleton needs the community to believe in the hound, needs the fear to be widespread and documented, so that when Sir Henry finally succumbs or is driven away, no one will question the supernatural explanation." Holmes's expression hardened. "He's farming fear, Watson, cultivating it like one of his specimens, and he's very, very good at it." "Then we must stop him." "We will. But we need evidence that will stand in court, not merely observation and deduction. I need you to do something rather dangerous tomorrow night." Watson straightened, alert. "Name it." "Stapleton has established a pattern. Every 3 nights, when conditions are favourable, darkness, mist, Sir Henry's nerves sufficiently frayed, he stages a manifestation. Tomorrow night is the 3rd night since the last incident. He'll move again. I need you to be visible, to walk the moor path toward Merripit House at dusk, providing him with the perfect target. But you must not react when you see the hound. You must observe, note details, and above all, you must listen for the whistle. I'll be positioned to intercept, but I need you to draw him out. You're asking me to be bait. I'm asking you to be my partner," Holmes said quietly. "As you've always been. Can you do it?" Watson met his friend's gaze and saw there not manipulation or callousness, but simple faith, the belief that Watson would hold steady, would play his part, would trust that Holmes's plan would work. "Of course," Watson said simply. Holmes nodded once, sharply. "Good. Then let me tell you exactly what to expect, and exactly when I'll close the trap." They spent the next hour in detailed planning, Holmes sketching sightlines and timing on the map, Watson memorizing landmarks and contingencies. The rain had stopped entirely now, and through the entrance of the stone hut, the moor stretched away toward evening, beautiful and treacherous and about to yield its secrets to the patient hand of reason. Tomorrow night, Watson thought. Tomorrow night the legend ends and the truth stands revealed. He just hoped they would both survive to see it. The day passed, with the peculiar slowness of time before action, each hour stretching like warm glass, beautiful and fragile and threatening to shatter under the weight of anticipation. Watson spent the morning affecting normalcy. Breakfast with Sir Henry, correspondence in the library, a brief inspection of the grounds, all while the coming evening pressed against his awareness, like a hand on the back of his neck. Sir Henry sensed something had shifted, though Watson had told him nothing of Holmes's presence or the plan that would unfold after dark. The young baronet moved through the house with increased restlessness, pausing frequently at windows to stare out across the moor, his hands clenching and unclenching as though preparing for a fight he could not quite identify. "You seem different today, Watson," Sir Henry observed over luncheon, pushing food around his plate without eating. "More settled, somehow, as though you've made a decision." "Perhaps I have," Watson replied carefully. "Perhaps we both have. We've been reacting to fear long enough. Tonight, I think it's time we met it directly." Sir Henry's gaze sharpened. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to take a walk at dusk along the path toward Merripit House. I'd ask you to remain here, Sir Henry. What happens tonight needs to happen without complication, and your presence would provide distraction. You're using yourself as bait." It was not a question. "I'm conducting an experiment of my own," Watson said. "Testing whether the hound prefers convenient victims or whether it might be encouraged to reveal its true nature." He met Sir Henry's eyes steadily. "Trust me, and stay in the house with the doors locked until I return." The afternoon crept forward. Watson cleaned his revolver with methodical care, checked his ammunition, wrote a brief letter to be posted only if he did not return. Simple precautions that felt both melodramatic and entirely necessary. Through the library windows, he watched the light change across the moor, watched the shadows lengthen and deepen, watched the first wisps of mist begin to form in the low places where water collected and peat breathed out its cold exhalations. By 4 o'clock, the fog was visible, not heavy yet, but building, rolling in from Grimpen Mire in slow waves that promised to thicken as temperature dropped and evening settled. Perfect conditions, Watson thought, exactly what Holmes had predicted. Stapleton would see this weather and know his moment had arrived. At 5:30, with the sun already hidden behind layers of grey cloud and the moor transforming into that liminal space between day and night, Watson dressed for his walk. Heavy coat, sturdy boots, the revolver in his right pocket, and a dark lantern in his left. He carried no walking stick tonight. His hands needed to be free. Sir Henry met him at the front door, his face set, with the kind of rigid control that comes from forcing down fear through sheer will. "If you're not back by midnight," he began. "Then send word to the village constable and to Scotland Yard," Watson finished. "But I will be back, Sir Henry. Tonight, one way or another, this business ends." He stepped out into the gathering darkness. The moor had transformed utterly from the daylight landscape Watson had come to know over the past days. The fog lay in drifting layers, thick at ground level, but thinning above, so that the tors rose from it like islands from a grey sea. Visibility shifted constantly, 20 yards of clarity, then sudden walls of mist, then openness again, the landscape revealing and concealing itself according to the wind's whim. Watson walked steadily along the path toward Merripit House, his footsteps quiet on the damp ground, his breathing controlled, all his senses straining for the first sign that he was no longer alone. Holmes would be somewhere ahead and to the left, positioned near the ridge where the signal mirrors had been found. The plan was simple. Watson would provide the visible target, drawing Stapleton's attention, while Holmes moved to cut off escape routes and document the machinery of deception. Simple plans, Watson reflected, had a way of becoming complicated when fear and fog and trained animals entered the equation. He had walked perhaps a quarter-mile from Baskerville Hall when he heard it. Distant at first, then closer, a long rising howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, the sound rolling across the moor and echoing off the granite tors until it was impossible to judge its source or distance. The legendary cry of the hound of the Baskervilles, manufactured by human malice, but no less chilling for its artificial origin. Watson stopped, forcing himself to stillness, and listened. Beneath the howl, almost inaudible, a high, thin note that made his teeth ache, the whistle, pitched at the very edge of his hearing. So Stapleton was nearby, coordinating his creation, summoning it to performance. The mist thickened suddenly, a wall of grey that reduced visibility to arm's length, and in that sudden blindness Watson heard footsteps, not human, but the soft padding of large paws on moorland turf, coming closer. His hand moved to the revolver in his pocket, fingers closing around its familiar grip, but he did not draw it. Not yet. Holmes had been explicit. Observe, document, wait for the certain moment. The footsteps circled him, moving through the fog with eerie precision, and Watson turned slowly, trying to track the sound, trying to pierce the grey curtain that surrounded him. His heart was beating hard now, the old soldier's response to imminent danger. But his hands remained steady. This was theatre, he reminded himself. Elaborate, dangerous theatre, but theatre nonetheless. The monster was a dog, the glowing jaws were chemistry, and somewhere in this fog was a man with a whistle and a plan that was about to fail. The mist thinned for a moment, and Watson saw it. 20 feet away, emerging from the fog like something from nightmare, was the hound. It was massive, easily 150 pounds of muscle and bone, with the broad head of a mastiff and the rangy build of a bloodhound. But what froze Watson's breath in his chest was not the size, but the appearance. Its jaws glowed with that same greenish phosphorescence he had seen on the shepherd's coat. Its eyes reflected light like burning coals, and as it opened its mouth to pant, the glow intensified, giving the impression of supernatural fire burning in its throat. Magnificent, Watson thought with a detached part of his mind that could still appreciate the artistry, even while the primitive part screamed at him to run. Stapleton had created something genuinely terrifying, something that would stop a man's heart, even if he knew intellectually that it was merely paint and training. The hound did not attack. It stood there, watching him, its posture not aggressive, but waiting for a command, Watson realized, waiting for the whistle that would tell it what to do next. Watson stayed absolutely still. His instructions from Holmes had been clear. Do not run, do not shoot, simply observe and wait. The hound was not the real threat. The man controlling it was. The high whistle came again, modulated differently this time, and the hound turned away from Watson, loping off into the mist, toward the north, toward the ridge where the signal mirrors waited. Watson watched it disappear, counted to 10, and then followed. The fog was thickening further now, the temperature dropping as full darkness arrived, and Watson moved carefully, following the sound of the hound's passage, rather than trying to track it visually. He could hear it ahead of him, moving with purpose, and beneath that sound, occasionally, the crunch of human footsteps on gravel. Stapleton, positioning himself for the next act of his performance. Watson climbed the ridge slowly, using his hands, as much as his feet on the steep sections, the granite slick with moisture and treacherous in the darkness. The hound's sounds had stopped, but he could sense presence ahead, could feel the weight of watching eyes. At the top of the ridge, the fog cleared momentarily, and Watson saw the full tableau Stapleton had prepared. The hound sat on the highest point of rock, positioned perfectly against the sky, its glowing jaws visible for miles. Behind it, angled to catch any stray light, were the signal mirrors, ready to multiply and reflect the image, to create the impression of multiple hounds, of an army of supernatural creatures. And standing 20 feet away, partially concealed behind a standing stone, was Stapleton himself, holding the whistle to his lips and a dark lantern in his other hand. Their eyes met across the grey distance, and Watson saw the moment recognition and calculation flashed across the naturalist's face. Stapleton had expected Sir Henry, terrified and alone. Instead, he had Watson, armed, aware, and anything but frightened. For a long moment, neither man moved. The hound remained in position, trained to hold, until the next command. The fog drifted between them in shifting veils, and somewhere in the darkness, Watson knew, Holmes was closing the trap. "Dr. Watson," Stapleton said finally, his voice carrying clearly in the still air, "I congratulate you. Not many men would walk alone into the mist after hearing that sound. You're either very brave or very foolish." "I'm neither," Watson replied, his hand still on the revolver in his pocket. "I'm simply a man who has learned to distinguish between natural and supernatural threats. And what you've created here, Mr. Stapleton, however impressive, is entirely natural." Stapleton smiled, a thin, cold expression that held no humour. "Is it? Are you certain? Can you truly look at what you've seen tonight and explain it all away with chemistry and training? Or is there a part of you, Doctor, Watson, however small, that wonders whether I've simply harnessed forces that already existed? Whether the legend of the hound might contain more truth than you're comfortable admitting?" "I'm comfortable admitting," came a new voice from the darkness behind Stapleton, "that you're under arrest for fraud, conspiracy to murder, and assault with intent to terrify." Sherlock Holmes stepped from concealment behind another standing stone, and Watson felt the profound relief that came from knowing his partner was exactly where he should be. Holmes held no weapon, but his posture radiated absolute confidence, and in his hand was a notebook, the evidence that would matter more than any revolver. Stapleton spun, the whistle falling from his lips, his free hand reaching into his coat for something Watson could not see. The hound, confused by the sudden movement, broke from its position and trotted towards Stapleton, seeking reassurance from its master. "I wouldn't," Holmes said quietly. "My associate has a clear shot, and I have 5 days of documented observation that places you at the scene of multiple incidents. Your journal alone would convict you, but I've also recovered samples of your phosphorescent compound, traced your purchases of the mirrors, and interviewed 3 villagers you paid to report sightings. Your experiment is over, Mr. Stapleton. The only question now is whether you come quietly, or whether this ends in violence." Watson had drawn his revolver during Holmes's speech, and now he aimed it steadily at Stapleton's centre mass. Not the head, not the limbs, the reliable target that would stop a threat without unnecessary risk. Stapleton looked between them, his sharp mind calculating odds and finding them insurmountable. The hound whined softly, sensing its master's distress, and somewhere in the distance Watson heard other sounds, footsteps, multiple sets, approaching from the direction of Grimpen village. The constabulary, summoned by Holmes's earlier message, arriving as planned. It was perfect, Stapleton said finally, his voice carrying genuine regret. The system was perfect. The fear was self-sustaining. I had proven that human perception could be manipulated as reliably as any chemical reaction. Sir Henry would have left within a month. The estate would have been vulnerable. And I would have demonstrated that the most powerful force in nature is not wind or water, but the story we tell ourselves in the dark. You demonstrated, Holmes said coldly, that cruelty disguised as science is still simply cruelty. Now, sir, your hands where I can see them. Watson, if you please. Watson moved forward, keeping the revolver trained on Stapleton, while Holmes secured the man's hands with rope he had brought for precisely this purpose. The hound, deprived of commands, sat quietly and watched with the patient confusion of an animal that had been taught to perform, but not to understand. The constables arrived minutes later, Cartwright among them, his face showing satisfaction mixed with something that might have been shame at having believed so readily in the supernatural. They took Stapleton into custody, and Holmes claimed the whistle, the lantern, and most importantly, the journal that contained all of Stapleton's careful documentation of his experiment in manufactured terror. As they descended the ridge toward Baskerville Hall, where Sir Henry waited with questions that would finally receive answers, Watson looked back once at the moor. The fog was clearing, the night sky showing stars, and the landscape looked suddenly smaller, less threatening, as though the arrest of one man had drained it of supernatural power. "Well done, Watson," Holmes said quietly. "We both played our parts," Watson replied, and together they walked home through a moor that was, at last, simply a moor. Morning arrived at Baskerville Hall with a quality of light that seemed almost apologetic, as though the sun itself was embarrassed by the previous night's revelations and sought to make amends through sheer brilliance. Watson woke to find his room flooded with golden illumination, the kind of autumn morning that renders the moor in shades of amber and bronze, transforming treachery into beauty, with nothing more than a shift in angle and atmosphere. He dressed slowly, his body carrying the familiar ache that came after action, not injury precisely, but the accumulated tension of danger now released, leaving muscles stiff and joints protesting. His hands, he noted with some satisfaction, were steady as he fastened his collar. The soldier's response: fear during the event, calm after, and only in the safety of aftermath did the body acknowledge what it had endured. Sir Henry was already in the breakfast room when Watson descended, but the young baronet was not eating. He sat at the head of the table, still dressed in yesterday's clothes, a cold cup of tea at his elbow, an exhaustion written in every line of his posture. He looked up as Watson entered, and his expression held a complicated mixture of relief, anger, and something that might have been grief. "Tell me," Sir Henry said without preamble. "Tell me everything. I've been sitting here since you left last night, and Barrymore wouldn't say a word beyond, 'Mr. Holmes has the matter in hand.' And I swear to God, Watson, if someone doesn't explain what happened on that moor, I'm going to walk out there myself and demand answers from the stones." Watson poured himself coffee, took the seat opposite Sir Henry, and began the accounting. He told it methodically, starting with Holmes's secret arrival days earlier, moving through the observations from the stone hut, the identification of Stapleton's techniques, and finally the confrontation on the ridge. He omitted nothing of substance: the whistle, the phosphorescent paint, the signal mirrors, the trained hound, laying out the machinery of deception with the careful precision of a physician explaining a diagnosis to a patient who needed to understand not just the conclusion, but the reasoning that had led there. Sir Henry listened without interrupting, his face hardening as the story progressed. And by the time Watson finished, the young man's hands were clenched into fists on the table. "He killed my uncle," Sir Henry said, his voice low and controlled. "Not with violence, but with fear. Deliberately frightened an old man to death as an experiment." "Yes," Watson said simply. There was no comfort to offer here, no softening of the truth. "And he would have done the same to me. Not quickly, perhaps, but eventually. Ground me down with terror until my heart failed, or my mind broke, or I simply fled and abandoned the estate that's been in my family for 300 years. That was his intention, yes." Sir Henry stood abruptly, walking to the window and staring out at the moor that had been his inheritance and his prison. "I want to understand," he said, after a long silence. "I want to know why. What kind of man does this? What kind of mind conceives it?" "That," said a familiar voice from the doorway, "is precisely the question I've been pondering all night." Sherlock Holmes entered the breakfast room, looking like a man who had slept in his clothes, which, Watson reflected, he probably had, but whose mind was operating at its customary sharp efficiency. He carried a leather satchel that Watson recognized as the one he kept for evidence, and he moved with the focused energy that always followed the successful conclusion of a case. "Mr. Holmes," Sir Henry said, turning from the window, "thank you. I understand I owe you my life, or at least my sanity." "You owe Watson your life," Holmes corrected, taking a seat and helping himself to toast with the casual familiarity of a man too absorbed in thought to observe social niceties. "I merely provided the theoretical framework. He provided the courage to test it under conditions that would have broken most men. But you raise an excellent question, Sir Henry, and I believe I have at least a partial answer." Holmes opened the satchel and withdrew Stapleton's journal, setting it carefully on the table. The leather cover was worn, the pages thick with entries, and even closed. It radiated a sense of obsessive documentation that made Watson uncomfortable. "I spent the remainder of last night reading this," Holmes said. "All of it. Every entry from the first page 5 years ago to the final notation from yesterday afternoon. And what emerges is the portrait of a man who is, in his own twisted way, entirely sincere. Stapleton genuinely believes he is conducting valuable scientific research. He sees no moral dimension to his actions, only empirical observation and hypothesis testing." Sir Henry moved back to the table, drawn despite himself. "That's madness." "No," Holmes said quietly. "It's something potentially more dangerous than madness. It's the complete absence of empathy wrapped in the language of scientific inquiry. May I read you something from the first entry?" Without waiting for permission, Holmes rarely did. He opened the journal to the beginning and began to read aloud. "I have secured residence at Merripit House with the intention of conducting longitudinal research on the malleability of human perception under conditions of sustained psychological pressure. The Baskerville family legend provides an ideal experimental framework. a culturally embedded narrative of supernatural threat, a family history of anxiety and premature death, and a geographically isolated subject population. My hypothesis: that fear, properly cultivated, can be made self-sustaining, requiring minimal ongoing intervention once initial conditions are established. My methodology will combine elements of classical conditioning, perceptual manipulation, and social reinforcement. The dependent variable is the subject's decision to abandon the hereditary estate. The independent variables are multiple, and will be refined during the experimental period. Holmes closed the journal and looked up. That's the opening entry. Scientific language, clear hypothesis, proper methodology. He's not a madman raving in the dark, gentlemen. He's a trained researcher who has decided that ethics are merely obstacles to knowledge. Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. And my uncle was his first subject. Sir Charles was his proof of concept, Holmes confirmed. The entries regarding him span 18 months. Stapleton began with subtle interventions, encouraging his superstitions, sharing carefully edited local legends, suggesting that the late-night walks Sir Charles took for his heart condition might be dangerous. Then escalated to staged sightings, distant howls, and finally, the full manifestation on the night of his death. Stapleton documented everything. Sir Charles's increasing anxiety, his changes in behaviour, his withdrawal from social engagement. And when Sir Charles died of heart failure on the Moor path, Stapleton recorded it as conclusive proof that psychological manipulation can produce measurable physiological outcomes. Sir Henry's face had gone pale. He writes about my uncle's death, like it was a successful experiment? Precisely like that, Holmes said. Because to Stapleton, that's exactly what it was. He expresses no remorse, no second thoughts, only satisfaction that his hypothesis was confirmed. And then he immediately began planning the next phase, replicating his results with you. Holmes flipped through the journal to a later section. Here, the day after you arrived at Baskerville Hall. New subject installed. Demographic profile. Male, age 31, colonial upbringing suggests reduced susceptibility to traditional British superstitions. Will require modified approach. Initial interventions designed to establish baseline fear response. Auditory stimuli. Olfactory cues, minor environmental manipulations. Subject shows promising signs of suggestibility despite stated skepticism. I was never skeptical, Sir Henry said, his voice hollow. I was terrified from the first night. I just refused to admit it. Which is exactly what Stapleton was counting on, Watson said gently. The performance of rationality while fear works beneath it. Holmes continued, his finger tracing entries. He documents everything with clinical precision. The timing of each howl, the placement of each piece of evidence, the cultivation of witness testimony in the village. He even notes his own performance during his visits to the hall. Maintained sympathetic demeanour. Expressed scientific skepticism regarding supernatural explanations, while simultaneously reinforcing fear through subtle verbal cues. Subject responded well to presence of educated authority figure who validates concern while offering no practical solution. He was playing both sides, Watson observed. The rational friend who understood your fear and the hidden architect creating it. The perfect gaslighting, Holmes agreed. And throughout it all, he's documenting not just his actions, but his rationale. He writes extensively about the philosophy underlying his research. Apparently, he believes that human behavior is entirely mechanistic, that free will is an illusion, and that demonstrating this through controlled experiments would represent a major scientific breakthrough. Holmes turned to a page near the end of the journal. This entry is from 3 days ago, after he visited you and met Watson. New variable introduced. Associate of subject has medical and potentially investigative training. Must assess threat level. Consider accelerating timeline or incorporating new element into experimental design. The presence of observer creates interesting opportunity to demonstrate robustness of fear-based manipulation even under conditions of heightened scrutiny. He saw me as part of the experiment, Watson said. He saw everything as part of the experiment, Holmes corrected. That's the essential point. To Stapleton, the entire world is a laboratory, and every person he encounters is either a subject or a tool. The hound, the villagers he paid for testimony, even his own sister. Holmes paused, glancing at Sir Henry. You met her, I believe? Briefly, Sir Henry confirmed. She seemed frightened of him. With good reason. Holmes withdrew another document from his satchel, this one official-looking with the seal of the Devonshire Constabulary. I had a long conversation with Miss Stapleton this morning after her brother was taken into custody. Her real name is Beryl Garcia. She's not his sister but his wife, brought from Costa Rica 5 years ago, and kept in virtual imprisonment at Merripit House. He forced her to participate in his schemes, threatened her with deportation, and worse if she refused, and used her as another variable in his experiments. Sir Henry's expression darkened further. Where is she now? Under protective custody in Grimpen, and she'll be provided passage to relatives in London once the legal formalities are concluded. She's suffered quite enough. Holmes closed the journal with a decisive snap. Which brings us to the question of what happens next. He'll stand trial, Sir Henry said flatly, for my uncle's murder, if nothing else. The legal situation is complex, Holmes admitted. Murder requires proving intent and causation, and Stapleton never physically harmed Sir Charles. He created conditions that led to heart failure, but proving that in court will be challenging. However, the case against him for fraud, conspiracy, endangerment, and false imprisonment of his wife is quite solid. I expect he'll spend a considerable time in prison, though perhaps not as long as we might wish. Watson leaned back in his chair, processing everything. The mechanics of the deception were clear now, documented in Stapleton's own hand. But something still troubled him, some element that didn't quite fit the pattern. The shepherd, Watson said suddenly, the man who died the morning I arrived, that wasn't just staging. That was an actual death. How does that fit Stapleton's clinical approach? Holmes's expression grew even more grim. The shepherd's death was, according to Stapleton's notes, an unexpected but valuable data point. The man apparently suffered from an undiagnosed heart condition. When Stapleton staged one of his manifestations near where the shepherd was working, the combination of the glowing hound and the high-frequency whistle triggered a cardiac event. Stapleton found the body, posed it to maximum effect, and recorded the incident as confirmation that fear response can prove fatal even in subjects not formally enrolled in the experimental protocol. "Dear God," Sir Henry said softly. "Quite," Holmes agreed. "It's that entry, more than any other, that convinced me of Stapleton's fundamental inhumanity. He discovered a dead man, and his first thought was not to seek help or show respect, but to arrange the corpse for theatrical impact and document the results. Silence settled over the breakfast room, heavy and uncomfortable. Outside, the moor stretched away in the morning light, beautiful and indifferent, already forgetting the small human drama that had played out across its ancient stones. Finally, Sir Henry spoke. "What about the hound, the actual dog?" "Ah," Holmes said, his expression softening slightly. "The dog is innocent, of course. It was simply trained to perform, rewarded for following commands, and had no understanding of the larger context. I've arranged for it to be taken in by a farmer near Grimpen, who has experience with large breeds. With proper care and retraining, it should make someone an excellent companion." "Good," Sir Henry said. "At least something in this whole wretched business deserves a second chance." Watson stood, moving to the window where Sir Henry had stood earlier, looking out at the landscape that had seemed so threatening just hours before. The moor hadn't changed, he reflected. The granite tors still rose against the sky. The mire still concealed its dangers beneath innocent-looking grass, and the wind still carried the scent of peat and heather. What had changed was understanding. Fear had been replaced by knowledge, and the supernatural had dissolved into the merely mechanical. "Will you stay?" Watson asked, turning back to Sir Henry. "At Baskerville Hall, I mean. Now that you know the truth." Sir Henry considered the question, his gaze moving around the room, taking in the portraits of ancestors, the weight of history, the accumulated inheritance that was both burden and birthright. "I think I must," he said finally. "Not despite what happened, but because of it. Stapleton wanted to prove that fear could drive me away, that legend and manipulation were stronger than reason and will. If I leave now, even knowing the truth, doesn't he win? Doesn't his experiment conclude successfully?" "A valid point," Holmes observed. "Besides," Sir Henry continued, a slight smile touching his features for the first time that morning, "someone needs to reclaim this place, restore it, fill it with life instead of fear, turn it into a home rather than a stage for someone else's twisted research. I think that's what I'll do. Not as a Baskerville fulfilling duty, but as Henry Baskerville choosing his own path." Watson felt unexpected warmth at this declaration. "Then you'll need friends," he said. "Holmes and I would be honored to visit from time to time. Help with the restoration, both practical and spiritual." "I'd like that very much," Sir Henry said simply. Holmes stood, gathering his satchel and preparing to depart. "I must return to London. Several other matters require attention. But Watson is right, Sir Henry. This house has been a laboratory. Long enough. Time to make it a home." They shook hands, three men who had faced fear together, and emerged not unscathed, but understanding. And through the window the moor looked on with its ancient patience, waiting, as it always had, for the next story to unfold across its timeless stones. The train to London departed Grimpen Station at 2:30 in the afternoon, and Watson stood on the platform beside Holmes, watching the final preparations with the particular melancholy that always accompanied the end of a case. Their bags were loaded, their tickets purchased, and in a few moments the locomotive would carry them away from Dartmoor and back to the familiar rhythms of Baker Street and the city that never quite slept. Sir Henry had accompanied them to the station, insisting on driving them himself in the dog-cart, and now he stood slightly apart, hands in his pockets, looking not at them, but at the moor that rose beyond the village, that vast expanse of moorland that had been his prison, and was now, by choice, his home. "You'll write?" Sir Henry asked, finally turning to face them. "We'll write," Watson confirmed, "and visit when cases permit. I suspect you'll make something quite remarkable of Baskerville Hall, given time and freedom from fear." "I hope so." Sir Henry extended his hand first to Holmes, then to Watson. "Thank you. Inadequate words, I know, but there aren't better ones for what you've done." Holmes accepted the handshake with unusual warmth. "You showed considerable courage, Sir Henry. Most men, confronted with what you faced, would have fled regardless of truth. You chose to stand and understand. That's rarer than you might think." The locomotive whistle blew, the conductor called the final boarding, and Watson and Holmes climbed aboard, settling into a first-class compartment as the train began its slow departure from the station. Watson watched through the window as Sir Henry grew smaller, a solitary figure on the platform, and then the station itself vanished behind a curve, and there was only the moor, stretching away toward horizons that seemed to have no end. "He'll be all right," Holmes said, not looking up from the newspaper he'd purchased. "He has the constitution for it, and more importantly, he has the will to reclaim what was nearly taken from him." Watson settled back into his seat, feeling the familiar rhythm of rail travel, that gentle rocking that always seemed conducive to reflection. "Tell me honestly, Holmes, when you first heard of the Baskerville case, did you suspect the truth immediately? Or was there a moment when you considered that the supernatural might actually be at play?" Holmes lowered his newspaper, a slight smile touching his features. "Are you asking whether I believe in curses, Watson?" "I suppose I am." "Then I'll give you an honest answer. I believe in the power of belief. I've seen men die from hexes that had no physical component, beyond their own conviction that death was inevitable. I've seen communities destroyed by superstitions that were entirely self-fulfilling. The line between supernatural and psychological is often thinner than rationalists like to admit." He folded the newspaper precisely. "But in this case, no. The moment I learned that a distant relative with scientific training had taken up residence near the estate just as the manifestations began, I knew we were dealing with human agency rather than spectral hounds. The only question was methodology. And Stapleton's journal confirmed everything. The journal was a gift, frankly. Most criminals have the good sense not to document their crimes in exhaustive detail. But Stapleton's need to frame his actions as research to justify them through the language of science meant he created the evidence of his own guilt. Holmes paused, his expression growing more thoughtful. "That journal will be studied for years, I suspect. Not just as legal evidence, but as a psychological document. What drives a man to that degree of detachment from human suffering? Is it innate or learned? Can it be identified early, prevented, treated?" "Philosophy questions," Watson observed. "Medical questions," Holmes corrected, "and you're better equipped to answer them than I am. You've seen men's minds break under stress, seen what trauma and isolation can do to moral reasoning. Is Stapleton mad, in the clinical sense? Or is he simply an extreme example of a type of person who exists more commonly than we'd like to acknowledge?" Watson considered this as the train carried them through the moorland, the landscape already beginning its transformation from the wild uplands toward the more cultivated countryside that surrounded the approaching towns. "I think," he said slowly, "that Stapleton represents what happens when intellectual curiosity becomes divorced from empathy. He's not mad in the sense of being unable to distinguish reality from delusion. He knew exactly what he was doing, understood cause and effect, predicted our outcomes with considerable accuracy. But somewhere in his development, the part of him that should have said, "This is wrong," simply never formed, or was deliberately suppressed. A chilling thought. Yes, Watson agreed, because it suggests that education and intelligence are no protection against inhumanity. That one can be brilliant and methodical and still be monstrous. They fell silent, each absorbed in his own thoughts, and the train rolled on through the autumn afternoon. The moor gave way to farmland, farmland to villages, villages to the outskirts of larger towns, and gradually the landscape took on the character of southern England, gentler, more domesticated, marked everywhere by human habitation and cultivation. Watson dozed briefly, the rhythmic motion of the train and the exhaustion of the past days finally claiming him, and when he woke, it was to find dusk settling across the countryside, and Holmes reading by the compartment's lamp, absorbed in what appeared to be a monograph on chemical compounds. "Nearly there," Holmes said without looking up. "Another hour to Paddington." Watson stretched, his body protesting the confinement of train travel after days of walking the open moor. "What's next for you? Another case waiting?" "Always another case," Holmes said, but there was satisfaction rather than weariness in his tone. "A matter of forged paintings, I believe. Considerably less dramatic than Glowing Hounds, but with its own elegance. And you? Will you write this one up for your readers?" Watson considered. "I think I must. Not immediately, perhaps. Let some time pass. Let Sir Henry settle into his new life without the immediate reminder. But eventually, yes. The story deserves telling, if only as a reminder that the most dangerous monsters are the ones we create ourselves." "A sobering moral," Holmes observed. "Your readers may prefer the Afghan adventures." "Perhaps," Watson acknowledged. "But this case taught me something, Holmes. Taught us both, I think. That fear is a weapon as dangerous as any knife or gun, and that the deliberate cultivation of terror is perhaps the cruelest form of violence, because it leaves no visible wound, provides no physical evidence, and destroys from within rather than without." Holmes closed his monograph, giving Watson his full attention. "Well said, and you're quite right. This case was unique in that regard. Stapleton didn't want to murder Sir Henry directly. He wanted to make Sir Henry murder himself, through fear and despair. A more subtle cruelty, and in some ways a more complete one." The train began to slow as they approached the outskirts of London, and through the windows Watson could see the familiar landmarks of the city appearing. The gas lamps beginning to glow in the gathering darkness, the smoke from countless chimneys, the dense warren of streets and buildings that marked civilization's triumph over wilderness. "Home," Watson said, feeling the words' weight and comfort. "Home," Holmes agreed, "where the fog is merely weather, the sounds in the night are cab wheels and delivery wagons, and if there are hounds, they're pulling carts and begging for scraps rather than glowing in darkness to terrify the living." They gathered their bags as the train pulled into Paddington Station, the platform crowded with evening travellers, the air thick with steam and coal smoke, and the particular energy of London at the day's end. A hansom was found, their bags loaded, and soon they were rattling through familiar streets toward Baker Street, and Mrs. Hudson's inevitable fussing over their absence. As they crossed Hyde Park, Watson looked back toward the west, toward where Dartmoor lay beyond the horizon. And he thought of Sir Henry alone in Baskerville Hall, beginning the slow work of reclaiming his inheritance from fear. Thought of the Moor itself, ancient and patient, already forgetting the small drama that had played across its stones. Thought of Stapleton in his cell, still believing, probably, that his research had been sound, even if its conclusion had been interrupted. And Watson thought of the hound, just a dog, trained and confused, now being retrained to be gentle, rather than terrifying, learning that the world held kindness as well as commands, treats as well as whistles pitched too high for human ears. Some monsters, Watson reflected, could be saved. Others could only be stopped. The cab turned onto Baker Street, and the familiar door of 221B appeared, lamplit and welcoming. Mrs. Hudson was indeed waiting, scolding and smiling in equal measure, and within minutes Watson was settled in his chair by the fire, a cup of tea in hand, listening to Holmes sort through a week's worth of correspondence with running commentary on the incompetence of various police inspectors and the decline of interesting crime in the modern age. Normal, safe, home. But that night, before sleep came, Watson sat at his desk and wrote the opening lines of a new story, one that would be titled The Hound of the Baskervilles. And as his pen moved across the paper, he thought about the nature of fear, the power of legend, and the simple, profound truth that the most terrifying monsters were always the ones that wore human faces. On Dartmoor, the moor lay quiet under starlight, beautiful and dangerous and indifferent, waiting as it had always waited for morning to come, and the slow turning of seasons to continue their ancient pattern. And in Baskerville Hall, a single light burned in the library window, where a young man sat planning the future of his inherited home, refusing to let fear write the final chapter of his family's long and complicated story. The hound was just a dog. The legend was just a tool. And the morning, when it came, would bring ordinary sunlight to illuminate ordinary ground, where men made their choices and lived with the consequences. And monsters existed only in the stories they agreed to believe. Welcome to Watson's Journal. Thank you for listening tonight. May your sleep be peaceful, your dreams gentle, and your morning free from phantom hounds. Until next time, rest well.